So what's the connection between your moral consciousness and your obedience to the law?
How is the way?
How do we get moral
the
consciousness?
access,
To moral consciousness? Nobody had any idea. I mean, somehow we get it through a combination of experience and intuition and thinking about the problems of others and so on. In fact, there's a definite broadening of moral consciousness over the ages. The things that were considered entirely legitimate, 200 years ago, are considered Nazi-like today. For example, if some third world country today were to produce something like the U.S. Constitution, which was a revolutionary document at the time, highly libertarian. If, say, some third world country today were to produce it, we'd call it a reversion to Nazism. Well, after all, you take a look at the U.S. Constitution, and there's a category of people who are described as 3/5 human. It's like if you're a slave owner, you get an extra 3/5 of a vote for every slave you have. Well, that's beyond discussion today, but it was quite in keeping with the attitudes of the time. In fact, not only slavery, but genocide was considered perfectly legitimate. Where I live in Massachusetts was, no Indians around because the Puritans just carried out genocide. And they considered that not only moral, but they thought they were following the word of God. And basically they were right. I mean, they appealed to the Old Testament, which is probably the most genocidal book in the whole literary canon, and said, look, we're doing what the Hebrews did to Amalek. When we wipe out the Pequots down to the last child, and disperse them to make sure that they don't reproduce and so on. And so that was considered highly moral. Genocide was considered highly moral, not just tolerable. You'd have to go pretty far to the limits to find somebody saying that today. Although, maybe not all that far, but pretty far. And the same comes right up to the present. I mean, questions about women's rights, for example, were not taken anywhere near as seriously 30 years ago as they are today. That's an expansion of moral consciousness. Questions about animal rights were unimaginable 20 years ago, but they're taken fairly seriously today. So, for example, there are now even laws for treatment of laboratory animals, which were unheard of 20 years ago. And there are many people who think that you shouldn't even allow that. I mean, vegetarianism is an expansion of the moral consciousness. What are the right expansions? One can debate. But that the moral sphere has been expanded is undoubtable, and that's indubitable. And that means that the only reasonable interpretation of that is that over time with this is over historical period, so it's not our personal experience, but over historical experience and accumulated historical experience and lots of struggle and conflict. We get a kind of access to our moral consciousness that one didn't have in an earlier period. And there's no reason to think that process, it's not a process of linear marching forward by any means. So if you go back 100 years ago, somebody like, say, Andrew Carnegie, the founder of the world's first billion-dollar corporation, at least publicly stated that he believed that things like wage labor were inhuman. That's what he said. He regarded socialism as such an obviously true ideal that if we ever reach it, we'll have achieved the millennium. Well, his counterpart wouldn't say that today. The idea that wage slavery is, and it was quite common among working people. Many people who fought in the Civil War, sort of ordinary working people, that thought that they were fighting to eliminate slavery, then became industrial workers in the growing industrial system of the post-Civil War period. It's quite common at that time to say, look, we fought to eliminate slavery. We're just being made slaves again by becoming tools of production in the new industrial system in which we have to follow the orders of the masters. That's what we fought against in the Civil War. Well, that's, I think, here, it made a difference of interpretation, but in my opinion, that was a level of insight into our moral nature that's been largely lost. The idea that renting yourself to others in order to survive is an infringement on your nature is something that was commonly understood a century ago and is barely in the sphere of cultured awareness today.